Hi there, my name is Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. The works of Stephen King provide us with no shortage of bad guys, ghouls, monsters, and madmen. Over the span of his nearly 50-year writing career, King has dreamt up every imaginable variety of nightmare creature, as well as innumerable iconic boogeymen, chief among them being the walking dude, the ageless stranger, the Dark Man himself, Randall Flagg. Flagg made his major debut appearance within the pages of King's 1978 novel The Stand, and he would go on to become the quintessential villain across the pages and decades of King's work. But in this video, I'll be discussing the illustrated poem The Dark Man. The predecessor to The Stand, The Dark Man, is the point of conception which led to the birth of Randall Flagg, and is an origin story of sorts for one of King's most notorious villains. History and background. Although Flagg made his official debut in The Stand, he was a character that King had been developing since his days in college. The first iteration of Flagg was, in fact, a poem scrawled haphazardly on the back of a restaurant placemat. When asked what inspired him to write the poem, King claimed the idea seemingly came out of nowhere, saying, quote, "This guy in cowboy boots who moved around on the roads, mostly hitchhiking at night, always wore jeans and a denim jacket. The thing about him that really attracted me was the idea of the villain as somebody who was always on the outside looking in and hated people who had good fellowship and good conversation and friends." Unquote. The poem originally saw publication in 1969 in Ubris, which was a literary journal published by the University of Maine, but it wasn't until much later in 2013 that the poem would see wider release in the illustrated book entitled The Dark Man. The poem The Dark Man tells the story of a shadowy stowaway riding the rails and wandering the rural underbelly of America, but rather than try to describe the poem, I'm just going to read it to you now. Following the reading of the poem, I'll take a moment to discuss the content of the poem itself, the illustrations from the poem, as well as the poetic form and style King uses in The Dark Man. The Dark Man. I have stridden the fuming way of sun-hammered tracks and smashed cinders. I have ridden rails and burned sterno in the gantry silence of hobo jungles. I am a dark man. I have ridden rails and passed the smuggery of desperate houses with counterfeit chimneys, and heard from the outside the inside clink of cocktail ice, while closed doors broke the world. And over it all a savage, sickle moon that bummed my eyes with bones of light. I have slept in glaring swamps where musk reek rose to mix with the sex smell of rotting cypress stumps, where witchfire clung in sunken psychospheres of baptism, and heard the suck of shadows, where a gutted, columned house leached with vines speaks to an overhung mushroom sky. I have fed dimes to cold machines in all-night filling stations, while traffic in a mad and flowing flame streaked red in 6 lanes of darkness, and breathed the cleaver hitchhike wind within the breakdown lane with thumb leveled, and saw shadowed faces made complacent, with heaters behind safety glass, faces that rose like complacent moons in riven monster orbits. And in a sudden, jugular flash, cold as the center of a sun, I forced a girl in a field of wheat, and left her sprawled with the virgin bread, a savage sacrifice and a sign to those who creep in fixed ways. I am a dark man. The overview. The poem. Alright, so what does this poem tell us about the Dark Man? Well, not much, really. Not directly, at least. Nearly the entire poem is used as a vehicle to provide descriptions of the places the Dark Man inhabits, rather than a study of the man himself. Similarly, the illustrations by Glenn Chadbourne show the run-down, dingy, dilapidated settings the poem describes in great detail, while obscuring and shadowing the man himself. Outside of the narrator, the Dark Man, stating, "I am a dark man," the reader isn't given much to go on in terms of just who this man is. More so, it is through his desire to reside within and move between these seedy, decrepit wastelands that the reader interprets what kind of man this is. One who would choose to immerse himself within and surround himself with an undesirable world filled with undesirable occupants. It's not until the final stanza of the poem that we witness what can only be interpreted as an act of violence perpetrated by the Dark Man, which validates our preconceived notions and confirms our suspicions. Something that can only be assumed upon reading the poem due to the vague, unconventional language is made glaringly obvious in the illustrations. The illustrations. Fellow Maine native Glenn Chadbourne has worked on numerous King-related projects, and a number of King novels have seen special Glenn Chadbourne editions. In addition to his King-based content, Chadbourne has worked on a variety of horror, thriller, comic book titles. It all began when he won a contest in the late 80s in which the Castle Rock newsletter requested their readers to submit their King-related artwork. Chadbourne's illustration style in The Dark Man could best be described as frantic and unrefined. It is indeed a fitting style to accompany the poem. Although I couldn't find any information on the medium Chadbourne used, it appears to have been done entirely with pen and ink. The stark landscapes, scrawled, mangled technique, and the harsh contrast of black ink on white page is impactful, and Chadbourne expertly complements the tone of King's text within his visuals. Form and style. While I am perhaps unqualified to discuss poetry at an academic level, I was able to determine that The Dark Man falls comfortably within two particular categories of poetic form, the first being free verse. Free verse poetry does not adhere to a consistent rhyme scheme. In The Dark Man, King seemingly makes no effort to rhyme or follow a recurring pattern of syllables or rhythms from one verse to the next, not that I could detect at least. The flow of the text feels more reminiscent of an internal monologue rather than that of a poem, which brings us to the second poetic form which fits The Dark Man, the soliloquy. A soliloquy is a monologue in which a character speaks to him or herself, expressing inner thoughts that an audience might not otherwise know. Considering we know the Dark Man himself is the narrator of the story, with lines like, "I have stridden the fuming way," and "I have ridden the rails," and "I am a dark man," I think this poem could certainly be considered a soliloquy, and while soliloquies are not definitionally poems, they often can be. Final thoughts. The Dark Man feels a bit like an unfinished idea, like an incomplete picture where the viewer can only see a small portion of the overall image while other areas are blurred and obscured. And that, of course, is exactly what this poem is. It's the beginning of an idea that would grow and develop and mutate into something far greater, into someone so vital to a universe that King would come to create over the span of 50 years. King had only just begun his writing career at the time he wrote this poem. In fact, his first published novel, Carrie, was still 5 years away, and so he was unable to foresee the path that Randall Flagg would eventually take. King couldn't possibly have predicted that this sudden burst of inspiration, haphazardly scrawled on a diner placemat, would become an integral character within his future body of work, an icon of the King canon, who was known by many names across the ages. Alright, the next video in the Stand series, also the last video in the Stand series, will focus on the 2020 TV series adaptation, which is probably the worst adaptation of The Stand. I'm not saying it's terrible, it's just not as good as the other adaptations that came before it. New videos drop on this channel every Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, so stab the reminder bell with your finger knife to get notifications. Okay, goodbye. Don't forget to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty please with blood and guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.